Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlinn
And Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Chaos.
And most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
All right, everyone, welcome to The Mything Link. I'm Dr. Randall. Who are you?
I'm Dr. Caitlinn.
And today we are doing one of our favorite Greek figures of all time, both of ours, Miss Medusa herself.
Mm-hmm. The woman, the myth, and the legend.
She is all the Gorgon, the myth, the legend. Also, as we've had to do for every other episode this season, content warning, we will be talking about themes of murder, sexual assault, forced childbirth,
violence
against women, violence in the patriarchy. So always fun stuff with us. We'll make sure to break the tension too. No worries. Also themes of racism as well, which we will absolutely be bringing in. So please consider this your content warning going forward.
So in Chaos, Medusa is played by Debbie Mazar. I think Debbie Mazar was the correct person to cast for Medusa. Like, she has that 1920s fierce glam look, like that
sass.
She does have that sass. She has that spicy.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, she's clearly not somebody to be fucked with.
No,
right?
Absolutely not.
Which we love about her. In Chaos, we see her as an employee, a worker in the underworld, and that doesn't match her story at all.
No.
Right? I don't think there's any stories of Medusa in the underworld. So we'll be going over what her story looks like today.
That might not be the most true. I know she's in the underworld.
Well, what the frick? She's in the underworld after she dies. Heracles sees her when he descends for his 12th labor to capture Cerberus.
That's what I was thinking of.
And she's a Gorgon demon was feared by Odysseus when he breached the underworld.
Okay, so
who that Medusa?
Who Medusa?
Who is she? The logo for Versace? Is that all she is?
Yes, that's it.
Well,
End
that is
here.
one of the
No need to go into any more detail.
So the traditional story of Medusa goes that she was a virginal devotee to the goddess Athena, and this meant that she took a vow of chastity, and that was part of her service and dedication to the temple. And in all of these stories, Medusa is typically described as being so beautiful that all the men just want to be with her, but she took this vow of chastity. And so she's seen as a tease. And one day Poseidon can't take it anymore. He comes up from the ocean and rapes her, typically on the temple floor. And Athena hears about it, sees it, knows it's happened. And she's understandably pissed at Poseidon, but she then curses Medusa, steals her beauty from her, turns her hair into snakes, curses her so anyone she looks at, any man who she looks at, will turn to stone. So Medusa becomes a recluse because she's such a hideous monster who nobody could come into contact with. And she basically goes off to an island, hides in a cave, and Perseus hears tales of this monster who has a garden essentially littered with statues of people who have tried to come and slay her, but have failed. So Perseus goes and he has a little trick up his sleeve because he uses a polished piece of brass, typically in most stories, to peer around the corner so he can see where Medusa is and cut off her head without looking her directly in the eye. and he puts her head in a bag with all the snakes writhing around, and he puts it on his shield and uses her glare to turn his enemies to stone in battle. And when he cuts her head off, 2 sons are born from the blood from the rape of Poseidon. And her sons are famously Pegasus, the winged horse, and her other son is less well known, Chryser. So in some of the stories, Medusa as a Gorgon has wings and snakes for hair, scaly skin, is really monstrous in appearance, and of course has terrifying eyes, because the eyes are the most evil part of her. They're the ones who will turn you to stone. And she's typically depicted as a monster or a villain. And in the story with Perseus, especially, she's seen as like a dragon to be slain for Perseus to achieve heroic status. So, since most of the stories that we know from Greek mythology come to us from an oral tradition, which means they were stories passed on from generation to generation, person to person, region to region, there's not one specific source text for Medusa's story. So today we're going to be using Hesiod's Theogony, which is an ancient Greek source. We are also going to be using Ovid's Metamorphoses, again, which is one of our best resources of Greek mythology, even though it's from a Roman perspective. And we're also going to be using a little bit of the Shield of Heracles as well.
And just our own collected knowledge over time. Again, this
absolutely.
is still like an oral tradition, and these myths are still being retold. So Randall and I have just collected knowledge about Medusa over our lifespans.
For sure, but we'll, as always, link those sources in our show notes. So in Ovid's Metamorphoses, we have the story in book 4. The very last story in book 4 is entitled Perseus and Medusa. And in Hesiod's Theogony, I think there's less than 10 lines dedicated to her. We spoke about 270 to like
270 to 277.
I'm going to say we're going to start with Hesiod's Theogony because it is the older source. It predates Ovid.
The Theogony was written sometime between 730 and 700 BCE.
So that means before Common Era. And Ovid's Metamorphoses wasn't published until 8 CE. So that's a difference of about 708 years. So huge difference. We tend to think of historical sources as kind of like existing in this ether of the past, kind of swirling around each other, right? Where we equate like an ancient source is an ancient source. But think about the reality of how much these stories and culture and everything changes in a span of 700 plus years. Like that's astronomical. I mean, think of how little we have in common with the folks who lived in what, 1200, 1300 CE? Wow, culturally speaking, like that's a huge span of development. And arguably our culture has developed at a far more rapid pace since the Industrial Revolution. This last chunk of a couple hundred years is not necessarily the equivalent, technologically speaking. But still, it's a huge change. And so we just want to be aware of that, with the oral history being what it is of mythology, where we're not able to fully know the original source of the story. It's important to ground ourselves in time and references. And in one of the earlier references that we have, Theogony, of Medusa's story, we only have 7 lines about her. And it's just basically describing her death and her sons, who she gave birth to as a direct result of her death. So we'll go into the specifics with Ovid's version because he draws it out a lot longer. He dedicates, I think, 3 pages to her story, the equivalent of 3 pages in our text here. To her story.
For me, it's only 1 page.
Oh, well, I guess it depends.
Mine's 2 pages. Sorry, I misspoke.
Whichever, doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Ovid dedicates significantly more text to Medusa's story, which fleshes out our understanding of her story in a lot more detail. So from Theogony, we really just hear that Medusa was a Gorgon.
Gorgonzola.
Oh yeah, Gorgonzola. Is that the fourth sister?
Gorgonzola.
Zola. Gorgon. God, Gorgonzola is like so gross too.
Ugh.
It smells like stinky feet. Medusa's eyes could turn people to stone, and Zola's scent could repel everyone.
Ew. I think I would choose like it would no turning people into Gorgonzola cheese would be like the far worse punishment in my book. It's disgusting.
I mean, it's not blue cheese, but it may as well be. It's so gross to me. More power to you if you like Gorgonzola or blue cheese. But people try to give it to me instead of goat cheese or feta. And I'm like, are you having a stroke? Because this is not an equivalent. Like, I get that it's cheese. That's nice.
Sometimes I think I really miss cheese. And then I think about cheeses like blue cheese and Gorgonzola. And I never want to eat cheese again. I have a serious dairy allergy and haven't had cheese in years. And I think about, like, I can still viscerally remember the taste of Gorgonzola, and
yeah, it tastes like an old gym sock.
Have you eaten an old gym sock before?
No, but I used to do wrestling, and I've opened my gym bag in high school. You know, like,
oh yeah,
just like the stench of sports equipment.
I had my bat bag had a very similar flavor.
Yeah. Can we write a fanfic about the fourth Gorgon named Zola?
Yes. I love me a good fanfic, as we've discussed previously.
Yes, we have. From Theogony, we really just hear Medusa. She suffered a woeful fate, and she was immortal, but her sisters were immortal, so she was growing old as they were staying the same age. The translation that I'll link in our show notes says, "With her lay the dark-haired one in a soft meadow amid spring flowers." And Ovid expands on that and very specifically says, "Her beauty led the ruler of the sea to rape her in Minerva's sanctuary." So Ovid is a lot more explicit about what happens. And again, like, this is one specific translation we're reading of the Metamorphoses, and the cultural context could have changed in those 700 years and change. And then it tells us that Perseus cut off Medusa's head, and that's how her sons were born, Chrysaor and the famous Pegasus, who later goes on to be a star in the story of Hercules. So yeah, it's just a few lines dedicated to her, saying that she lay with Poseidon in a meadow, and Perseus cut off her head, and from the blood sprang her two sons. That's pretty much all we get of her story in Theogony. And
Ovid's not much better, even though there's a little more here, because in the Metamorphoses, we're hearing the story of Medusa from the mouth of Perseus. And
fuck Perseus. Let me hear about it.
It all comes back to the fact that in a lot of ways, historically and even now, Medusa almost embodies this like male anxiety about powerful women. And I know that you and I have talked about this before, but like, what better way to squelch a powerful woman than by have the patriarchy tell her story, to create her to be something monstrous and even more fearsome than she already is,
to take away control of her narrative. That's because, like what we mostly have, right? Like, how we tell our story.
In that, even though there's more explicit language about Poseidon raping her, is the exact language that Ovid is using, we still have that framed with her beauty led the ruler of the sea to rape her. So from the perspective of Perseus and perhaps arguably even Ovid, she's invited this rape somehow. So at the end of the day,
it's her that caused the action to happen to her, even if it was unintentional.
I'm not sure if it says in either of these texts, but historically speaking, Medusa in her mortal form was perceived and understood to be very beautiful. She was the only
Right.
mortal of her sisters and was very sought after, if you will.
What I love about the story of Medusa is that she didn't do anything actively to be a villain in any of these source texts that we have of her. Like many women in many mythological traditions around the world, she is disempowered, disenfranchised. Her voice is taken from her, and the story we most know about her is the story of her death, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like Caitlin was talking about, it's Perseus's story so often.
Mm-hmm.
But what I really love about Medusa's story is she's not a hero. She's not willfully attacking people and raging out. And so we could really interpret her story in a different way and think that perhaps Athena didn't curse her by turning her skin to scales and taking away her classic beauty. Perhaps what Athena did was remove her from the curse of being the object of the male gaze.
Making it so that never again will Medusa have to experience what she did at the hands of Poseidon. Now you better watch the fuck out.
Now she's been empowered to with the tools to literally stop someone in their tracks if they're coming to cause her harm.
Right.
To freeze them in their tracks. And not to talk about Rocky Horror Picture Show again, but they do have the Medusa lever.
They do.
To turn them into stone before the stage show.
Yeah, I like to see this story and like celebrate Medusa and her power. I like to see it as a story of solidarity between powerful women, which is all women, all vagina owners, anybody who identifies as a woman is a powerful woman. I was just rereading Ovid's version, and there's an acknowledgement that Athena saw what was happening with Poseidon raping Medusa and hid her face behind her shield, which will famously eventually bear Medusa's head on it. It literally says, the goddess hid her face behind her aegis, but she made Medusa pay. So there's, in Ovid's version, an acknowledgement that Athena sees what's happened and hides, and still, knowing that it wasn't Medusa's fault, chooses to punish Medusa. I don't like to see it that way, because for one, we're hearing this story from Perseus's mouth. It's like double the patriarchy here, like double jeopardy happening. Ovid through Perseus.
Consider the narrator, consider who's telling the story. This isn't Medusa's story, this is Perseus's story. And he's explaining why he murdered her.
Yeah.
And of course,
trying to justify it.
Look at the genocide that's currently happening in Palestine right now, right? The IDF is making monsters out of regular people trying to live their lives. And in doing so, not to bring up another episode of the Black Mirror, but they have an episode specifically talking about this, where Black Mirror, spoiler alert for a 20-year-old episode that I show in my classes. So if you're my student listening to this, sorry. There's an episode of the Black Mirror where the military implants a filter that shows the enemy as monsters, like as literal, like monster animals. And they delete your memory of accepting the change. And so it isn't until somebody erases theirs or it malfunctions or whatever, and they see what they're actually doing. Like, these aren't monsters. They don't have genetic defects. Like, these are just regular people. And it really hits home the idea of how we ostracize and demonize and other people, designating them as other with a capital O, that we are able to make them the enemy because we have dehumanized them. And that's what the story of Medusa is teaching as well.
I mean, just on a basic psychological level, we did something wrong, right? And so impulse, human behavior says we are going to try to justify that to ourselves to get rid of and assuage guilt, or, make it understandable so we're not the bad guy when we tell the story, which is literally what Perseus is doing here. He's telling it in a specific way so as to communicate that he's the hero, but he's doing it with this almost like mock humility, right? He's not talking about his other heroic endeavors. He's just like making himself seem like a sympathetic figure for like accurately telling Medusa's story is how I read it. And I just, every time I read or hear one of these myths of Medusa, I have to ask myself, anybody who's available, who is actually the monster here?
Right.
Because it's certainly not Medusa. It's certainly not the young...
monster. Is the monster the young woman who's a religious devotee?
Right. Minding her own business.
Who got attacked and assaulted.
Right. And going back to something that I've said repeatedly over the time that we've been doing this podcast, it's like word for word from the Planned Parenthood website. You cannot consent. A young virginal devotee, mortal devotee, cannot consent to Poseidon because the power differential is so vast. What's going to happen if she says no? There's no safe way for her to say no. He will smite her. He will punish her. She can't say no.
You hit the nail on the head. There's no safe way to say no.
No.
You say yes because that is better than the alternative, right? Like that is so important to just hammer home right now.
When I was at the doctor telling them what had happened to me, the doctor told me that I should start carrying a condom with me and they encourage all vagina owners to do this because if you're ever getting raped, it's easier to say, can you just put this on, than it is to push someone off of you and protect yourself like that. It's easier to say, yes, can you just wear a condom?
Well, because when the alternative is death, like this is a man or bear situation. When the Me Too movement was at a zenith, I remember when the allegations against Louis C.K. came out very specifically because he didn't understand that he was sexually abusing anybody because he got consent every single time.
Right.
And it was always consent, manufactured consent.
Right. You can't.
Because you cannot, because he was a celebrity and a star, and these women were oftentimes like working for him or interned by him or interned by the studios or whatever. They're in a position where they know their jobs, their livelihood, their reputation could immediately go out the window with one phone call from this person. That's how much power they wield. And so of course people are saying yes, right? This is the same mentality as like the entourages and whatever, like the yes people that surround people of power, because it's easier to do what they say, even if it comes at a cost to you.
Right.
Because the cost if you don't comply is so much greater.
Yes. That brings me to something that I have written down in my notes, is that the association between Medusa and Me Too. Randall, you just briefly mentioned it, but back in, I think, 2008, there was this guy, Luciano Garbati, I think his name was, who made this carving of Medusa holding a severed Perseus's head. It was in front of the court in New York where Harvey Weinstein was eventually tried for his rape-yes-ho ways.
Oh, those...
Basically, the symbol of Medusa, like the question of what if this was Medusa's story? What if this was actually Medusa's victory? Became a big question for at least this carving. I mean, there's a reason why Medusa became an associated symbol with the Me Too movement. And a lot of that had to do with, a woman who was put in this situation by a man of power that they couldn't escape from, becoming a symbol of strength, becoming this beloved of the goddess, because one way to interpret Athena transforming Medusa into having hair of snakes and giving her the ability to turn those threatening her into stone is Athena being in solidarity with Medusa and giving her the power, like we just said, to protect herself. And so there's a reason why people who've survived sexual assault often find solace and strength in the image of Medusa.
Right, because while Medusa has a tragic end, like we can't change the ending of Medusa's story, right? Regardless of who's telling it, it's a tragic ending that sacrifices her to the patriarchy, essentially.
Right. I love feminist ideas of Medusa. I have a tattoo of a fucking powerful ass Medusa on a mountain of skulls on my arm. She is like, I love this idea of her just being this autonomous, powerful woman. Like, so there's a reason why Medusa became associated with the Me Too movement. However, at the same time, the association of this particular statue of Medusa with the Me Too movement, it's incredibly problematic because this statue of Medusa is not one that lends itself to portraying Medusa as this fearsome protector of herself and autonomy and women. This statue is one that, instead of focused on her powerful head, it's very focused on her very white, very thin, very sexualized body. And so this statue very much is a portrayal, a very intimate portrayal of the epitome of the white male gaze in a lot of ways. She looks very much like a sort of vixen, even down to like the fierce look in her eye. And the way she's like, even though she's holding Perseus' severed head and the sword with which she did it, she does not look very fearsome or threatening. And so a lot of women have started to be like, well, hold up a second. I'm not sure about this particular statue of Medusa in association with Me Too, especially because the Me Too movement was started by a big, beautiful Black woman. And it was almost like whoever carved this statue and decided this was the one that goes in front of the courthouse in New York City, front and center, ignored this like multiplicitous variety of people identifying as women around them and just decided like, we're going to carve this very attractive, sexually available looking woman to be Medusa. Like, this is a very European looking, beautiful woman carved by a white European man.
I want to define really quick when we're talking about the male gaze. The male gaze is essentially a female character or portrayal of a female that exists purely for a man's enjoyment. Usually in a sexual way. So it's like that thing where video game characters, the men get full sets of armor and the women are wearing bikinis.
Yep.
Like that's a prime example of what the male gaze is.
It's true.
And so when we're saying gaze, we're saying Gaze. So essentially existing for men to gaze at. And then we can take that same concept and apply it to specific subgroups like the white cis het male gaze. We could talk about the female gaze. Does it exist? There's a lot of discourse around that. So essentially, we're saying that these female characters exist in a way, and this statue especially, it's not existing in a way that a woman or somebody who's not a sexual icon would be depicted in their strength and their power. Instead, they're shown as someone to be like an object of desire.
Right. Which is really contradictory to
the whole story.
The whole story of Medusa. That's why I look at this. I mean, I like the idea of the statue, but I'm like, the longer I look at it, I'm like, well, she don't look like me. Like, most people don't like her.
I would also like to reference that sculpture, the Garbati sculpture of Medusa holding Perseus's head, was made in direct response to a statue of Perseus holding Medusa's head, right?
And standing on her body.
Exactly, by Benvenuto Cellin.
I know what statue you're talking about, but
yeah, it's a very specific statue. So it does exist in that context, like as a response.
Also, something that I think really interesting too is, I feel like Medusa's historically been seen as a really negative figure, terrifying, not in a good, powerful way, kind of scary. But in ancient Greece, snakes, they were a symbol of, rebirth and renewal because snakes shed their skin, which I think is really poignant here because Medusa is rebirth and renewed. She does shed her skin and become a more powerful form of herself.
Absolutely. Yeah. She sheds the version of who she used to be and steps into this new iteration. And it's pretty awesome. And that's what's amazing about the story of Medusa and why we can really reframe it and stop seeing her as a villain and start seeing her as a victim who was then empowered to go and do what she wanted. Presumably she wanted a nice, quiet life, right? Where she's chaste, she's devoted to the temple, she's chilling, kind of like a nun status, right? And some stories of her say that when she was she banished? Did she get an all expenses paid trip to go live on an island in solitude by herself and have the power to destroy anyone who came near her to disturb her peace? She's a hero.
Fucking Perseus, man. What a dick.
Right? And yeah, absolutely. It's ridiculous. So
well, he, I guess, was sent there by somebody else, but still.
Wasn't he sent there by I'm not super familiar with Perseus's story.
It's kind of like parallel to Heracles. Like some king Polydactes tells Perseus to go kill Medusa or some shit, and then Perseus uses Medusa's head to like turn hundreds of people into stone and a sea monster, and he rescues the beautiful girl. It's, you know, the same story that we've heard a million times. Can I read you this poem about Medusa?
Yes.
It's called Medusa by Larissa Lee. They say I ran to Artemis when men with stone faces and hard hearts came chasing after me, to take things I had not offered. Her advice to me was simple: stop running, woman child, turn your face to them. They say you make them hard, make it true, make them harder. Make their blood turn stone with your righteous fury. So I did. Stories spread, gossips nothing new. Suddenly I was a monster with snakes for hair, like they'd never seen dreadlocks before, like I couldn't be dangerous without my venomous creatures crawling out from my skin. But hey, it kept people away most of the time, kept me safe from their wandering eyes. I didn't do anything to anyone innocent. Men who came to me, they knew what they were coming for. They came to take me, came to take my life, came to take my body, came to take my power. I didn't let them. I have a garden full of statues in honor of their ignorance.
Ooh, I love it.
Yeah, me too. Gives me chills.
Yeah. So there are some interpretations of the Medusa story that suggest that perhaps her hair of snakes was a symbolic representation of a person with locked hair, that this could really be a coded story of racism from what we today would consider someone who is white presenting, and a story about them distancing and othering a woman of color who had locks in her hair that they referred to as snakes. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the term lock, its cultural significance. So colloquially, the hairstyle has been called dreadlocks for hundreds of years, and there's not a clear origin to the word dreadlock, but some historians believe that it comes from this idea that when the British ships came to Kenya, there's a story that explains that British folks were fighting Kenyans and thought their locks were dreadful and started calling them dreadlocks, because lock just means hair, piece of hair. Think about a locket, a little piece of hair, a lock of hair in your locket.
Did I have a locket of your hair in it, do you think?
Ooh, yes. So a lot of people think that dreadlocks have a negative connotation because of this idea that dread comes from dreadful, and it means some like dreadful hair, and it's a value judgment essentially. So there has been a lot of discourse around that, and a lot of folks who have that hairstyle prefer to refer to them as locks instead of dreadlocks, to remove that racial connotation from them, because it was done in a derogatory sense. Like with most etymology, it's likely we'll never know 100% for sure where the term first originated, but that's a fairly popular theory that has gotten a lot of steam and discourse recently. So a lot of people think it's much more respectful to refer to them as locks instead of dreadlocks, and that's the language that I'll be trying to use throughout our discussion. Again, right, like so many of us, we go through our whole lives using one term, and then we learn the history, and when we know better, we do better, and sometimes we slip up, and that's when we call each other in instead of calling out, and just try to make sure we're taking accountability and prioritizing. Yeah, so the history of locks in America is complicated at best and racist and catastrophic at worst. And locks are something that there have had to be laws passed for people to wear their hair in its natural state or in a protective hairstyle, such as braids. I wouldn't call locks a protective hairstyle. They kind of destroy your hair. I don't know.
They do.
Come at me. Are locks considered a protective hairstyle? I know braids are. I identify as white. From what I know of my family's history, we're white, and I've got curly hair that would naturally lock if I didn't comb through it, for sure. But it's seen by many in the US that for folks who are white to have braids or locks, that is considered cultural appropriation because of the complicated history of hairstyles in the US. So it used to be legal for employers to not hire people based on those hairstyles, or to say that those hairstyles weren't allowed at work because they were considered unprofessional. So in the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, it was seen as a source of pride, a source of Black pride, to be wearing locks or to be wearing natural hair in whatever style that looked like, or different protective styles, as opposed to wigs or straightening their hair or trying to conform to white Eurocentric beauty standards, right? And so in that context, locks are often seen as a powerful thing, as a crown, as something glorious. And we can really start reinterpreting Medusa's story in so many ways. And that's just my favorite thing about Medusa. She's such a queen.
Yeah.
And I love that Ovid specifically talks about how beautiful Medusa's hair was. He says, book 4, around line 795, her form was graced by many splendors, yet there was no other beauty she possessed that could surpass the splendor of her hair. And this I learned from one who said he'd seen her. So we have Perseus telling the story and repeating gossip he's heard from somebody else through Ovid's book. Like, how many layers of unreliable narrators are we gonna have about this woman?
And that,
this
folks,
Gorgon?
is why oral traditions are not the most reliable sources.
Ancient games of telephone, right?
It's true.
So we see that she had glorious hair to begin with, and who knows who was telling that story, because maybe her glorious hair was in locks all along.
And
maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a glorious crowning afro that she then, maybe her sisters in community did her hair.
I love that idea.
Right? What a fun image of the Gorgons sitting around in a sleepover.
Oh, I love it.
Hair, right? Medusa is such an inspiring and beautiful character.
She is.
And once we remove the lens of the patriarchy and stop focusing on Perseus's hero's journey and start focusing on Medusa as the main character, I think the image becomes a lot clearer. What a magical gal.
We already talked about Medusa's ending being tragic, no matter who's telling it, right? Like, it truly is. She is decapitated by a man and then non-consensually used to turn more people to stone in a way that she never did. As an object of war. As an object of war. No longer is she an object of men's gaze. She's now a weapon at the patriarchy's hand, right? Perseus is using her head to go around fucking turning people to stone. In contrast to her quietly living on her island and the men who come to try and kill her getting turned to stone. All she was doing was fucking defending herself. Now all of a sudden she's like, I don't know, some sort of nuclear weapon that Perseus is wielding to get what he wants. It's so gross. It's all gross.
And it's interesting because if we read between the lines here, at least in Ovid's version, Medusa's living with her sisters.
Yeah.
And they don't turn to stone. They all live together. So could it be the intent of the person who's approaching? Could Medusa have more control over her gift in life than she's given credit for? And perhaps is it only in death where she's used indiscriminately as an object of war, right? Talk about objectifying women.
Here's something that I have been thinking about a lot and have thought about a lot. What if, hear me out, Medusa, we're told from the beginning, is beautiful, virginal, working at the temple of Athena, right? male frustration that the object of their lust and desire is just out of reach, will never choose them. So what do? What does Poseidon do? He takes it by force. And so think of it this way. Have you ever been approached by a cishet man who you turn down?
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Who you turn down and they lose it. All of a sudden, you're a monster. All of a sudden, you're the problem. You must be a horrible monster, yada, yada, yada. It can't possibly be their fault. So
it's a sour grape situation.
What if Medusa, what if all along she never actually had this power to turn men to stone? What if this is just a story that they've crafted so that other men don't feel as bad about themselves and being afraid of a powerful woman who isn't fucking afraid to stand up for herself?
This is like a vagina dentata situation.
Yes, exactly.
Vagina dentata context, vaginas with teeth, that culturally stories of men trying to deflower women and being scared of their scary teeth vaginas. And then that just led to more violence against women, not like, wow, badass, like you have that powerful gift. And what a gift would a vagina dentata be? Because if you really had that power as a woman to chop off a ween when it's forcibly entering you, that's a fucking gift and not a curse, right? Who is telling these stories? No. For today, for our cultural context, that's the power of mythology, that it can grow and morph and change to reflect the current cultural value system. And this is how Medusa's story changes with us and changes with our culture to reflect what we care about, to reflect what matters, to reflect the journey that we've made as a society to say that women, not only are women more than victims, women are full people, complex beings who are valuable of telling their own story, not just having their story told by the men who enacted violence against them.
I think about, and I feel like I've had this rampage to you before, but
give it to me. Give it to me, baby.
And I feel like it's because you and I both understand what it's like to be, I'm aggressive in saying what I want and setting my own boundaries and not letting, I will take no shit if at all possible. How many times have I been called a bitch because I set a boundary? How many times have I been portrayed as some sort of evil harlot slut who's someone who's mean because I said, no thanks, not available for that, right? And I think that's part of why I like feel so strongly in solidarity with Medusa, because like she's just going about her own fucking business and like defends herself when some entitled asshole comes at her. She rightfully says, nope, hard boundary there, and they're going, you fucking monster, you fucking bitch. How many times have I been called bullshit like that just for standing up for myself, for taking care of myself in the way that I need? Well, how dare I, as a woman, take up fucking space and not at least have some minimal capacity to take care of the people around me at all times? My whole life has been this, I've been enshrouded in being taught that it's my job, no matter how I'm feeling, where I'm at, what I'm doing as a woman, that I must always be available to take care of other people, no matter what. And oftentimes, at almost all times, at the expense of myself. No, I want to be like Medusa. You fucking come at me with that bullshit, I'm going to turn you to stone. I will tell you hard no, mic drop, move on. Because I deserve to fucking take up space. I deserve to fucking have an island of the statues of the people who expected things of me that do not align with my worldview. That's selfish of them, not me. And so I feel this like solidarity with Medusa and want her as on my own aegis because she's strong, she's powerful.
She's strong, she's bucking the patriarchy, she's living her life intentionally around community with other women, right? Both in her choice at the Temple of Athena and then living in solitude with her sisters. And it doesn't even necessarily say that they're in solitude.
No.
It says there's a shelter ringed by sturdy walls, and the Grey sisters lived at the entranceway, famously the gals who share one eyeball.
If you and I didn't have such a sensory nightmare about hair, I would sit in a cave and braid your hair like those sisters did.
Oh, we can brush each other's hair.
I'll try not to rip your scalp off.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh yeah, no, I'll brush it first. I won't come with it tangled. I wouldn't be able to handle that. No, I'm more like a social groomer. I enjoy a social grooming session. We're primates. Come on.
All right.
But I'd like to point out that Ovid says that she lives in a house with her sisters, and along the fields and paths where Perseus had trekked, he saw the forms of men and animals who had been changed to stone because their gaze had dared to spy upon Medusa's face. Only men and animals. So again, with the intent here, perhaps, or again, perhaps Medusa has more control over her gift than previously.
I wonder if it was
thought.
just boy animals.
Ooh, interesting. Just the mean ones?
Yeah. Because, they can be rapey too. Like otters. Otters are so rapey.
And dolphins. Ovid uses the value judgment language when he's talking about Medusa's snakes. He refers to her hair as, quote, horrid snakes. And I mean, we can relate that to the idea of dreadlocks, right? With the value judgment behind it. And he also says that to this day, Athena, to dismay and terrify her foes, wears on her breast the very snakes that she herself had set as punishment upon Medusa's head. Or perhaps does she wear them as a token to remind her of strength and power and autonomy? Or shoot, maybe it's just a cool token of a friend, to remember Medusa by. Ooh, or lover.
When I do my Medusa retelling, they're going to be lovers.
Medusa and Athena? Ooh. Secret lovers. Are they going to be like pining for each other though, right? Is that why Medusa joins the temple? Because she wants to bang Athena?
No, it's going to be like a that's how they meet situation.
Okay, I see. Interesting.
We'll see though, if I ever write that book.
We will see. Can't wait to read it. In Hesiod's Shield of Heracles, it's the epic poem that tells the story of the 12 labors of Hercules. It tells his story. And it mentions... Oh,
no. No chance, no way.
I won't say it. Oh, no.
It's too cliche.
Oh.
I won't deny it. Oh.
This scene won't play.
I won't say I'm in love. Sha-la-la-la-la-la.
Okay. So we only get a very brief reference of Medusa in the story of Heracles. And what's interesting is this is the only time we see her in the underworld. And in Chaos, she's portrayed exclusively in the underworld. They don't go into her story. They don't mention Perseus. They don't mention anything. They just show her with her snakes, wrapped oftentimes under like a scarf, head turban, a protective bonnet of sorts. Interesting. It's pretty interesting that they chose the Medusa of the underworld as the one to represent in the show. And she's such a complex and interesting character that I get it. Like going into her any more than that surface level would have taken over the show, I think. And that show was about Orpheus and Eurydice.
It is interesting. Something that's also interesting is that her head is still on her shoulders in Chaos.
Right. Well, when you go to the Greek underworld, do you go with your injuries? This is something we explored last week, because when Eurydice, but she was also freshly in the underworld. He came down immediately.
So you think people could like heal over time?
I don't know.
Well, how would you would you grow a new head? If she did grow a new head, why does it still have snakes?
Well, I think perhaps you become more and more distanced from your life and the details of your life and the trauma of your life and all of those things fade. So perhaps it's that way in a physical sense as well. Because maybe she plopped her head back on and wrapped a ribbon around it. And then one day she didn't need the ribbon anymore. She removed the green ribbon and her head fell off.
She wrapped a snake around it.
But I really liked how in Chaos they portrayed Medusa's snakes as in motion and writhing. I thought that was a really, really cool touch. And
she says, "Wake me up," to one of them when she's taking a nap. I thought that was so cute.
Yeah, I was like, wait, do they all have different personalities and she has different relationships with each of them? Because that's
I love
fun.
That is so fun.
That is so fun.
I love that. I hope
Yeah.
so.
And she's
I
not.
guess we'll never know.
And I also love, though, how Chaos doesn't portray her as a villain at all. Perseus isn't even part of the story. And that's lovely. There's no shield. There's no beheading. She's shown as complete and whole. And most of what people know about Medusa is that she's a monster from Greek mythology with snakes for hair who turns people to stone. And they incorporated those elements and told a new story.
Yeah, she's both stern and tender, is something that I
Yes.
appreciated about her portrayal in Chaos.
Absolutely. I thought they did a great job with that casting. And she just was so snarky and no nonsense and very obviously able to set a strong boundary. And I thought that was a great read on the character and a great reference to her story.
I know, I loved it.
Yes.
I'm continually impressed with the detail and like honor that they've given to a lot of the myths that they've referenced here.
In Chaos?
In Chaos, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because clearly somebody did their research to some degree, at least on Medusa, to have portrayed her as, you know.
And I would love to see the notes for that and the direction for that character. Like how much of it was Debbie Mazur? How much of that was Debbie Mazur's interpretation of the character and her portrayal and her delivery of the lines, right? I think I might need to go back and rewatch some of her scenes.
Yeah, me too.
And think about that specifically, like with that question in mind, because I know I put my lens of who I think Medusa is and who she should be. And she's such a strong and powerful woman to me. So when I saw that interpretation of the character, I was like, yep, like that is my Medusa.
Yep.
And yeah, she just did such a great job. Just no nonsense. And I love that.
Yeah.
I love a gal who is not afraid to set her boundaries. I really respect it. I also want to shout out that Medusa is featured in the book Cassandra Speaks by Elizabeth Lesser. This is a book I really love using with my students. It's a really approachable text for people outside of academia. You definitely don't need to be an expert in mythology to read this. The tagline is, "When women are the storytellers, the human story changes." So in this book, Lesser looks at Medusa as a figure, and she talks about Cassandra, who we're going to look at later this season as well. And she begs the question, what story would Eve have told about picking the apple? Why is Pandora blamed for opening the box? How would these stories change if women were the storytellers? So we'll link that in our show notes as well. And a few years ago, we did, I think, a 3-part video series on YouTube breaking down Cassandra Speaks. So I'll link that in our show notes as well.
It reminded me of another thought that I had about snakes. The mention of Eve spurred this in my brain. The symbolism of snakes with powerful women is not only relegated to Greco-Roman antiquity. Snakes were also associated with fertility, even in Greco-Roman antiquity. That goes back even further into ancient Mesopotamia, which is typically my area of expertise. And so there's a reason why most modern Bibles that it's been portrayed as a snake that's tempting Eve with the apple, because snakes as a symbol of fertility, particularly women's sexuality, there's interpretations of the snake, the evil that tempts Eve away from perfection in the garden is sexual autonomy. And so there's a long interpretive history of the symbolism of snakes being associated with women's autonomy and the fear that men have of women listening to the snake, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have images coming to us specifically in Minoan art with snakes and spirals. And they have a pretty famous statue. It's just called the Minoan snake goddess. And she's depicted in a skirt and she's holding a snake in each hand. And we'll put a picture of that on our Instagram. But we don't typically see any other goddesses or other figures that have snakes in their hair. There's an Egyptian god who's depicted with the head of a viper. But I would not say that those two things are equal. So Medusa is a pretty unique figure when it comes to mythology. Snakes are not. Snakes as a symbol in Hindu mythology, there's a lot of snake symbolism as well. But the specific image of snakes as hair is pretty unique to Medusa.
Yes.
And if you're listening to this and say that I'm wrong, please correct me. I'd love to learn. I haven't come across any in my research.
I was going to say, I think that the closest you would get is Lilith and the snake.
And the devil, of course.
Right.
Some interpretations of the story of Adam and Eve say that the snake is the devil in disguise. So I guess there's stories of deities, figures shape-shifting into snakes.
Arguably, and I don't know if I can be quoted on this, but the Hebrew word more closely resembles serpent. And there's a specific reference to Elohim taking away its ability to walk and have arms. So I don't even know. I think there's a reason, a political reason. Yeah, I think there's a political reason why that story has been associated with the snake. And I think it's particularly to damn female autonomy and sexuality.
In Genesis, they specifically, because in some Renaissance and medieval paintings, the serpent is depicted with hands and feet, and it's creepy. And
a human
they
face.
have the, yes, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do, because we send each other weird medieval animal art all the time.
Well, no, I don't think I've sent you this very specific snake, but you know the snake.
No, but I know the snake you're thinking of.
In Van der Gogh's painting portrayal of Adam and Eve, the serpent has hands and feet, and Genesis tells us that the serpent's punishment for participating in the fall of man was to slither on its belly for the rest of its days. And so we get this pourquoi tale aspect of it, which helps us like make sense of the world, and it answers the question, why do snakes not have arms and legs? Why do snakes slither on their belly? Genesis answers a lot of those questions. Why isn't life perfect? Why do women have pain in childbirth? Why is menstruation painful? Why do men have to till the land when the animals can just graze anywhere? Right? Like, these are the questions that Genesis answers.
Which was the fucking point of oral mythology.
Making sense and meaning of the world around us.
When people are like literal 7-day creationists, I'm like,
it literally says in the Bible that to God a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. It doesn't say that it is. It's a fucking simile. It's a commentary on how to God time is meaningless.
It's all a metaphor. It's all a metaphor. Come at me. Come at me. I think almost all of Genesis is a metaphor. Oral tradition was not meant to be taken literally, people. Also, the Hebrew word that we translate as day is yom. It's Y-O-W-M in English. It literally means any discernible length or indiscernible length of time. It could literally mean a minute, or it could mean 1,000,000 years. It just means time. It just means a span of time. It is not, they didn't even have 24-hour, I mean, they had, right? The sun rose and it's set. For fuck's sake, people, let's get it together here. 2 of every animal is not gonna fit on a goddamn boat built by some Middle Eastern half-ass, not really even carpenter. God damn it. Likely, only part of the world flooded. I need to stop.
My favorite depiction of Noah is when they have the animals going on 2 by 2 and there's 2 male lions.
Good luck reproducing the new world, repopulating the new world.
And ancient astronaut theorists suggest that perhaps Noah didn't build an ark and bring animals on 2 by 2, but perhaps he collected the DNA to repopulate the earth, and that's how he could fit it
what
on
is
the
that?
ark.
Jurassic Park?
Jurassic Ark.
Jurassic Ark. Jeff Goldblum, we have a new idea for you now that Chaos is canceled.
Oh man. It also makes me think of Wayne's World. Come bust a move where the games are played. It's hip, it's fresh, it's Noah's Arcade.
Oh, I haven't watched that in a really long time. Man. Also, ancient astronaut theorists.
Yeah, tell me more about the ancient astronaut theorists.
I don't know anything about them.
Oh, you don't? Well, that's dumb.
Yeah, it is dumb.
So ancient astronaut theorists speculate that perhaps the story is symbolic, just like you said, and the only way that ancient peoples would be able to explain what was happening would be to say that they brought the animals on 2 by 2, because what really happened was they extracted DNA so they could repopulate the earth afterwards.
I agreed with most of that until the DNA extraction.
Then what part did you agree with? Because that was the whole part.
I mean, think about it though.
I am thinking about it. What are you thinking about?
You just talked about Genesis being the mythological explanation for why snakes don't have legs, etc.
Etc.
I mean, like, if a flood is happening in your very small world, where the only language you really have is like your own interpretation of science and the divine, wouldn't you be like, oh, the whole world is flooding? Because your whole world was flooding. You brought on 2 of every animal on your farm because the whole world was flooding, right? I mean, it's super likely that the Tigris and Euphrates flood. They flood
That's why it's called the Fertile Crescent.
Right,
no?
exactly.
That's why it's literally called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means between 2 rivers. Meso, in the middle of the rivers. Potamia.
Yep.
Potamuses. Yes. Right? Hippopotamus, water horse. Potamus. Yep. In almost... Not almost every
fucking ancient Mesopotamian city-state tradition, religion, they all have a flood narrative. All of them.
Okay, it's not just Mesopotamian. Let's talk about floods, baby. Let's talk about you and me.
Yeah, I mean, floods are a supernatural part of human existence.
I would argue they're a natural part, not a supernatural part. Zing.
Also of just general existence, not necessarily just human existence. Okay, we need to not talk about floods right now. Existence on Earth.
Okay, I will say almost every culture has a flood narrative, because what is the one fucking thing humans need to survive? Water. Humans always live by water. If they survive to tell their stories, they're going to have stories about water. And what do rivers do? Oftentimes they flood. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded violently and unpredictably. And therefore, their religion, their understanding of gods, was that gods were violent and unpredictable. In contrast, we have ancient Egypt, who the Nile flooded regularly and consistently, and they used it for agriculture in regular, consistent cycles. And they had
and needed a different it to survive.
View, a different cyclical view of their deities and nature and the relationship between them because of the environment that they came from. And I think it's just really important to remember that.
I agree.
Great.
Completely.
Have a great night. Love you.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Ulyate and Caitlinn Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlinn Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective, Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwehcollective.org. Thanks for listening.
We do this at least once every time we record.
We've been recording for like 2.5 hours.